பேராசிரியர் ஜேக் லிஞ்ச் அவர்களை அழைக்கின்ற நேரம். May I call upon Professor Jake Lynch from University of Sydney. He will be speaking on the subject of applying peace journalism in accountability process. May I welcome Professor Jake Lynch to take the podium.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much to our host for what I'm reliably informed was that generous introduction. I don't know whether you know, but yes, I do now have a post in a university. I'm the director of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. But before then, I spent a near 20-year career in professional journalism. And in my opinion, journalism is a calling and a persuasion. So I still think of myself as a kind of journalist in academics' clothing, or if you like, a hackademic. And a portion of my career was spent at the BBC, and also a portion at Sky News. Sky News. In other words, I belong to that group of journalists who has worked for Rupert Murdoch, and not the other group who will work for Rupert Murdoch. And during my time at Sky News, I was a political correspondent, and I used to have to go to summit meetings. So I went to European Union summits at Nice and Luxembourg and Brussels, Cardiff, places like this. And I had to take my turn at a job which political correspondents do at these gatherings, which is to go and record the pooled interview with the Prime Minister for the British media. And you go along with your camera in the morning and ask a few fairly choreographed questions of the Prime Minister and get some words on tape, which you then share with other broadcasters. That's the system, and you take it in turns. And the camera crew generally tries to frame the interview in such a way as to communicate a sense of place. So a favourite is the picture window or the balcony of the Prime Minister's hotel suite, for example, with a redolent city skyline in the background, which announces we are in Nice, or we are in Cardiff, or wherever we happen to be. So it was interesting to me to see just such an interview taking place with the present British Prime Minister, David Cameron, after his attendance at the CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in, of course, Colombo late last year. And as people here will know well, David Cameron came under considerable pressure to join a number of other heads of government in boycotting that meeting in protest at the unresolved allegations, highly serious allegations of course, hanging over members of the host government up to and including the President himself. Nonetheless, David Cameron did go to this meeting, as you know, and he did two things. First of all, he got himself a 45-minute private meeting with President Rajapaksa, where he gave him, by all accounts, a good old-fashioned British telling off, and said, look, this really won't do, Mr. Rajapaksa. You must submit to this investigation. And then, in this pooled interview, David Cameron was stood on the balcony of his hotel suite, not with a city skyline in the background, but a vertiginous drop to a beach behind him, and a kind of curved stretch of palm-fringed coastline. And it was for all the world as if he was going further and further and further back under this kind of political pressure. And then he was turning his trademark shade of pink, which he adopts when under close questioning in the House of Commons. And there it was, finally, he said, he disgorged the statement that lots of us have been waiting for, that yes, Britain will use its diplomacy to press for an independent international investigation of war crimes allegations at the Human Rights Council meeting, then upcoming in March of this year, and we finally got it. So very significant, I think, in the context of this gathering and in the context of our shared persuasion and mission of journalism, that the significant shift in Britain's diplomatic stance on that very important question took place not in the House of Commons, but in front of a television camera on a hotel balcony at a summit. And I think that is important because it speaks to us about the essential role of journalism as an enabler of democracy and accountability. Because you see, what is underway finally now with this independent international investigation of these very serious allegations is that we are witnessing something which maintains the possibility of enforcing accountability by the international community in terms of the standards of behaviour that are acceptable on the part of governments when faced with unresolved issues of conflict. And that's very important, because that is a standard which can be held as universally applicable, that there should be no exceptions to these standards. These standards include those laid down in the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which govern, for example, the conduct of military operations and the fact that they should make every reasonable effort not to harm civilian bystanders. It's only people directly involved in conflict who should be targeted. So that's a standard which is treated as customary law in the international community, and there must be no derogation from those kinds of standards. And the investigation, I think, is extremely important in signalling that the international community remains determined to uphold those standards. And the pressure on heads of government like Mr. Cameron and on governments whose representatives finally in Geneva did agree to take that step has come, let's not forget, largely through the media. Largely through the media. There has been a very impressive record of collaboration between journalists from among the Tamil community and those in mainstream media, notably here in the UK, like Channel 4 television, for example, to bring out and bring to the attention of the outside world important evidence and important facts about what went on during the final phase of the Civil War 5 years ago, and therefore foregrounding the need for that to be further investigated and the need for those standards to be upheld. And it may be slightly surprising, I think, to some of you to hear me as an academic use the word facts. And that's a very important word. Journalism, to an extent, is a way of distinguishing facts from claims. The news is not supposed to be a point of view. The news is supposed to equip us with the means on which we can judge competing points of view. And there have been prominent cases where journalism has got into trouble and arguably got the rest of us into trouble by taking claims and applying to them a kind of misleading glaze of authenticity. And claims have attained a kind of ersatz status of facticity by repetition in the media. I'm thinking, for example, of the phrase Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. That felt like a fact, but actually turned out to be not just a claim, but a completely unfounded claim. But by the time we realised that, it had got us into all sorts of trouble. But there is an equal and opposite problem, which is the problem of facts being downgraded to the status of contested claims. There are, for example, well-paid lobbyists in London and elsewhere taking the shilling of oil companies, whose job it is to put pressure on people like journalists to regard anthropogenic climate change not as a fact, but as only one side of the story, requiring to be balanced with the equally valid other side of the story. There are people who take up the cudgels on behalf of certain activities of the government of Israel, who would have us believe that the occupation of Palestinian territory that's been going on since 1967 is not actually illegal, and that's not a fact, that's only one narrative. And there's an equally important other narrative. And as I'm sure many of you are well aware, that kind of effort is also underway around the material that reached global audiences through the series of documentaries and investigative journalism done by Channel 4 television with the help and collaboration of so many colleagues from among Tamil communities. The Sri Lankan government, with the help of highly paid lobbyists, is disseminating evidence. Quite a bit of it reaches me through my email inbox. Quite what I've done to deserve this privilege, I'm not sure, which is devoted to attacking and downgrading the kind of evidence presented in those films from the status of reportable facts to one which should be regarded instead as just one side of the story, requiring to be balanced by the other side of the story. So journalism, I think, has to retain that mission, has to retain that capacity to distinguish facts from claims. And therefore it's extremely encouraging that it seems to have fed into a decision by the international community finally to grasp the nettle and say it's not good enough just to have these very serious war crimes allegations investigated by the Sri Lankan government itself through the so-called LLRC. Instead, no, we need to have a higher standard than that. We need to distinguish facts from claims, and we need to arrive at a version of these events that we can all be happy with. If the truth cannot be accessed as it is, then at least it can be assembled as agreed by considering an appropriately layered picture of the evidence built up from different levels. So that's highly encouraging, and it's a good mark for journalism. And journalism, I think, needs to build on that success, in particular by enhancing and stepping up collaboration, both between journalists and between journalists and other interested groups and parties. For example, one of the notable collaborations between journalists and non-journalists has been with the WikiLeaks organization. WikiLeaks, which has set up very innovative platforms, as you know, to enable whistleblowers to bring material to light which had previously remained hidden in the public interest. And one of them was the gigantic trove of material from the US diplomatic cables that WikiLeaks brought to light a few years ago. And of course, in that enormous motherlode of material, what it then required was it required the skills of professional journalists to go into it and find the stories in it and bring them to global attention. And one of the very important stories, as you may recall, was a cable sent to the State Department in Washington from the American Embassy in Colombo. And at this gathering, there was a gathering of ambassadors, including the American ambassador and several others, which held a meeting in Colombo with President Rajapaksa himself. And this was about 3 weeks before the end of the bombardment of Tamil people by the Sri Lankan armed forces. And President Rajapaksa had, by that stage, been enjoined by the international community to declare certain areas to be safe areas. That is to say, to give the impression that they would thenceforth be exempt from attack. But the cable disclosed by WikiLeaks noted that the American ambassador had actually had with him aerial photographs from a US reconnaissance asset, a stationary satellite, which showed that the bombardment had actually continued in these areas from before Rajapaksa's announcement to afterwards. And the cable concludes with the observation that we ambassadors, the American ambassador, the American embassy, we have no direct control over what the Sri Lankan government will now do with this information, but at least we have given the opportunity to the President to take decisive action to protect civilians if he wishes to do so. Now, of course, the evidence is that no such decisive action was taken. The interim fact-finding mission sent in by the United Nations to pave the way for this new investigation itself found that the bombardment of those areas continued willy-nilly through and after that period. And so therefore that, in a sense, constitutes some of the strongest evidence, some of the strongest prima facie evidence of command responsibility for war crimes on the part of Rajapaksa himself and his government. So again, that's collaboration by journalists with WikiLeaks in that case to bring this very important information to light. And that kind of investigation is, I am very glad to say, still a great strength of journalism in many places, including here in the UK. There are, of course, other aspects where journalism probably provides a weaker service to its readers and audiences, and those weaknesses are equally well known. And one account of them, which has been highly influential, at least to me, is called the structure of foreign news. The structure of foreign news is a famous academic essay. That's a fairly small category, by the way. It's a famous academic essay about 50 years ago, which showed that the stories that journalists tend to cover are ones which meet the economic needs of the news industry. So when they are reporting conflicts in particular, what they tend to concentrate on are things that happen with a clear beginning, middle and end, all of which take place in the interval between deadlines. And the example it gives of covering a conflict in the essay is of a soldier being shot, falling and dying on a battlefield. That then becomes a reportable event. Because if you are a daily newspaper, for example, which is the medium being studied in this essay, you have an edition tomorrow and you have to report what's changed since your edition of today. So everything has to happen in the interval between those deadlines if it's going to be a reportable story. But of course that leaves out an enormous amount of material pertinent to the conflict. It begs the question of how the conflict came to be responded to with that kind of organised violence in the first place. Who said it should, and with what motive? What is it about this conflict? In what other ways could those issues be addressed? And that is where what our host was mentioning, the notion of peace journalism comes in. Peace journalism is a program, a reform program for journalism, for media. It's been adopted in various places around the world, which has as its aim a restitution of some of these missing elements. And one of the things it tries to do is tries to restore to the coverage of conflict a sense of what that conflict is about, what is motivating people to join in the conflict. And what we tend to find is that people are motivated by having to protect themselves, defend themselves, having to try to take action to secure basic rights and freedoms against tyranny and oppression. Tyranny and oppression such as, for example, being deprived of the right to use their own language in official communications. Tyranny and oppression such as being excluded from educational opportunities. These are the experiences which the Tamil people have had over the years, which are still remain to be addressed. And what we really need from journalism, as well as exposing evidence of war crimes and holding us to the standard of facts and distinguishing them from claims, what we really need is a continuing sense that even though, for the moment, the war is over, the conflict is not over. There are still people being deprived of basic rights and freedoms. There are still people in want of justice, not merely the form of justice of seeing people prosecuted for war crimes, but political justice. Political justice to take due cognizance of claims to self-determination. This is what the conflict is about, and journalistic accounts which omit this material should be seen as somehow in want, somehow lacking. So that's in brief terms is the kind of concern, the kind of insight that has given rise to this activity of peace journalism. And as to pick up the cue from the title from my remarks, that I think therefore is a missing component of accountability. And what we need to see as we go forward is not merely a steady supply of news as the UN Human Rights Council investigates war crimes allegations and what they find and what they say should happen, but we also need to see a continuing reminder to readers and audiences about the underlying issues of rights and freedoms which remain unresolved and demand our attention. And if journalism could do that, then it really would be in business and we really would have cause to be grateful for it. So thank you very much for listening and bon appetit.